A very good morning to one and all present here. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. A very good morning to one and all present here. I welcome you all in the 3-day of our online FDP on innovations in disaster management and disaster risk reduction on behalf of GPTC Kottayam. Today is our last day of our 3-day journey. So, learn from yesterday, live for today, hope for tomorrow. The important thing is not to stop questioning. From this word, we will start our first session. Before starting the session, participants please note that a feedback form will be shared at the end of each session through chat box of Google Meet platform. There will be a few questions along with the feedback form. Submit your responses in the feedback form without fail. Okay, let's start our session. The session is handled by Ms. Reshmati Vilasan, PhD scholar at VNIT Nagpur. Let's have a glance through her profile. She did her MTech in urban planning from VNIT itself. She worked as an urban planner at Kerala State Disaster Management Authority. Before that, she worked at High Life Construction Thrissur. Currently, she is doing her PhD on wetland planning and conservation at VNIT Nagpur. With great pleasure, I will invite Ms. Reshmati Vilasan for handling our fifth session of our FDP, Hazard Vulnerability and Risk Management. Ma'am, please.
Hello, thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Okay, let me share my presentation first.
Okay.
Hello.
Yes, ma'am.
Is my slide is visible to?
Yes. Can you put it in the
Yeah.
slideshow. Okay.
Okay, is it fine?
Ma'am, can you put in the slideshow mode?
Actually, I'm keeping, but it's not coming. I don't know why.
Okay. It's okay, you can continue, ma'am.
Yeah, now is that in PowerPoint mode or?
No, it's in PowerPoint mode, not in slideshow mode.
Okay.
Now it's.
Let me check. I don't know what is happening over here.
No problem, continue with it. Can you full screen? Okay.
Okay, now is it visible?
Yes, visible.
But it's not in slide share.
Yes.
Okay. Once
No
again.
problem, ma'am. Continue.
Okay. Thank you for introducing me for this faculty development program, and I'm so happy to be a part of this. And I am Reshma Vilasan, currently working as urban planner, and I had an experience of working in urban planner as an urban planner in Kerala State Disaster Management Authority, and currently I'm a PhD scholar of VNIT Nagpur. So here, my task is to explain about what disaster risk management and vulnerability assessment is, and hope this is the second day of faculty development program, and you will be familiar with what disaster is. And
no, ma'am, it's third day.
Third day,
yes.
Sorry. So you will be familiar about all the terminologies which we used in this disaster risk management. And what I am going to present is what is disaster risk, fundamentals of disaster risk reduction, disaster risk management and assessment, and vulnerability, what vulnerability is, and types of vulnerability, vulnerability assessment, how we can assess the vulnerability, and a profile. Hazard risk vulnerability analysis, I'll be explaining in detail, and how we can do a hazard risk vulnerability of a city, and after all the city disaster management plan and risk sensitive planning. I hope this session is on to the technical part, and I'll be taking more on the technical part. If you people are having any doubt or clearance, you can may interrupt my presentation. There is no issue. In between, you can ask me questions, because it's a bit confused. Like it's purely of technical, you may be getting some doubts in between, and you can ask at any time. So shall we move with the presentation?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So coming to the fundamentals of disaster risk, we will be talking about the fundamentals of disaster risk. Hello.
Yes, ma'am, audible.
But I think my slide, it is not coming properly.
You second, we are getting third slide.
Third slide, but here I'm not able to see my slides. Let me. Once again, I'll share. Sorry for the interruption. Once again, let me try to share this. Hello.
Yes, ma'am.
Hello. Now is it visible?
Yeah, it's visible.
So this is in
And now
slide.
it's
Okay.
in
Yes.
slideshow mode.
Okay.
Ma'am, can you switch on your
So
video if you are comfortable?
yeah. That's fine. Is my video is on? Okay, fine.
Yeah, fine.
So coming to the disaster risk, fundamentals of disaster risk, I'll be explaining what disaster risk is. So the disaster risk is the potential loss of life, injury, or destroyed or damaged assets which could occur to a system or a society or a community in specific period of time, determined probabilistically as a function of hazard, exposure, vulnerability. So this is little bit complicated. So just we can say that disaster risk is a function of four factors, that is hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and coping capacity, of which the first three indicators are the hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. increases as the disaster risk increases, and if the coping capacity increases, the disaster risk decreases. This we can see it in a formula. Disaster risk is directly proportional to hazard, vulnerability, and exposure, and inversely proportional to the coping capacity. So let us go by one. First is, what is hazard? A process or phenomena or a human activity that may cause loss of life, injury, or other health impact, property damage, social and economic disruption, or environmental degradation. This we can put it simply as hazard is anything which has the potential to cause damage. Whether it causes damage or not, or the extent of damage is dependent on other factors, but hazard is simply anything which may cause damage. But it's very interestingly, we can say that earthquake, tsunamis, cyclones are not disasters. But for us, it is not digestible. But let me tell you why we are saying this is not disasters. This earthquake, cyclones, tsunamis are natural phenomena and natural process of earth. They happened thousands of years ago. Like now it is happening, and we can't deny the fact that they will happen in the future too. This may cause damages and they may not. If they cause loss of life or property damage, we can call them as disaster. But otherwise, would it be wise to term as event as disasters? No. These are the natural hazards. And if when it causes the damage to the property or human life, we will call it as disasters. So what we want to convey is the fact that until these events like earthquake, cyclone, flood, tsunami do not affect our environment, it may term as hazards, not as disasters. So with the same understanding, United Nations Office on Disaster Risk Reduction has classified hazards into the following type as geological or geophysical hazards, hydrometeorological hazards, technological hazards, biological and environmental hazards. In addition to the above classification, in a very generic sense, hazards can be said of two types: natural hazards and man-made hazards. Natural hazards includes earthquake, cyclones, heat waves, and the man-made hazards due to man-made human activities, anthropogenic activities like fires, explosion in refineries and oil spills. And before we move on to the next sessions, we should point out at the potential to cause damages and loss. Only if they cause damages and loss, we may call it as disasters, or otherwise we will call it as hazards. So next is exposure. Next terminology is exposure. So whenever you think of a hazard, say earthquake or a cyclone, it affects an area or it may affect the people. So understand the exposure. First and foremost thing that we need to do is understanding the spatial extent of the probable effects of the hazard that we are considering. This may refer as hazard prone area. We will be calling as, if it is an earthquake, we will be calling as earthquake prone area, flood prone area, cyclone prone area, and all. Once we have done that, exposure is simple to understand the situation of the people, infrastructure, housing, production capacities, or other tangible human assets located in the hazard prone area. So simply, we will be putting in a simple form. If the hazard that we are considering is to occur, what all may get affected? People may get affected. Public infrastructure like electricity distribution, telecommunication system, transport system may get affected. Industries and factories may get affected. So all these things constitute the exposure to the hazard. So all this while we have been talking about hazard, which is an event which may cause damage and losses. We have been talking about exposure, that is those elements which are exposed to hazard and it may be impacted and affected in the hazard strike. But the thing is, do you think what actually determined the extent of impact of a degree of damage of the exposed hazard? We were talking about hazards will be happening and what is the exposure of the hazard and what actually determined the extent of impact. This brings to the factor called the vulnerability. So what vulnerability is? The vulnerability is the condition of the exposed assets determined by physical, social, economic and environmental factors or process which increase the susceptibility of an individual or a community, asset or a system to the impact of hazards. Let me take an example of a hazard to better understanding what vulnerability is. Let us say earthquake. Let us assume that earthquake hits a city. The city is exposed to the earthquake. Residents of the city, various infrastructure of the city are exposed to the earthquake. So there are different dimensions of vulnerability, which include the physical vulnerability, as in the strength of the building or the infrastructure in that city, economic vulnerability, as in the strength of the or the capacity of the household of a community to sail through such an extreme event without being dragged down to the poverty, etc. And all the dimensions of the vulnerability determine the extent or degree of impact of a hazard. So we can say that lesser the vulnerability, lesser will be the impact and vice versa. I hope the concept till now are clear, and let me proceed to the other section. That is, we have discussed hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and we are left with the last fourth important factor of the disaster risk, that is coping capacity, which I've already told you that it is inversely proportional to the disaster risk. And what coping capacity is? Coping capacity is the ability of the people, organization, and the system using available skills and resources to manage adverse conditions. Simply put, anything or everything that saves an individual or a family or a community on the dreadful day can be regarded as coping capacity. This coping capacity can be enhanced through awareness program, proper education from the childhood, and we need to aware the people about the hazards which are hitting in their city or in their area. So while hazard, exposure, vulnerability contribute to the increase of the disaster risk, coping capacity contribute towards the decreasing the disaster risk. If this is clear, we can say it as when disaster risk goes beyond the coping capacity of a community or an individual, the hazard becomes a disaster. And this is exactly what the Disaster Management Act of 2005 says. The definition as such is disaster means a catastrophe, mishap, calamity or grave occurrence in any area arising from natural or man-made cause or by accident or negligence, which result in substantial loss of life or human sufferings or damage to degradation of environment and is of such a nature or magnitude to be beyond the coping capacity of a community of the affected area. So the definition says the same thing that we have been discussing. When the loss of life, damage, degradation goes beyond the coping capacity of the community, then only we will be saying as hazard becomes a disaster. So let us conclude this session as hazards. Hazards are hazards are almost part of our life. During any monsoon period, floods may occur and during harsh summer, heat waves are expected. But if we do not take anything to reduce our vulnerability and increase our capacity, a flood or a heat wave became a hazard, became a disaster. So a hazard became a disaster when we choose to ignore our vulnerability. So to conclude, we can say it as hazard can be natural or man-made, but the disasters are not natural. So this is an overall thing of disaster risk. We already gone through the dimensions of what disaster risk is. Three increasing factors like exposure, vulnerability, and the inversely proportional to the coping capacity of the people or the community over there. So next is what disaster risk reduction is, what disaster risk management, and what disaster risk assessment. We got a nice idea of what is disaster risk. So next thing is we need to know how to reduce the disaster and how to assess the disaster and how to manage this. So this is the definition. I'll go through the definition first and we will be going in detail. Before going in detail, you have any doubts on this disaster risk or anything which I have completed, or you will be asking questions at the end?
Continue, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you. So next is disaster risk reduction. What disaster risk reduction is? The disaster risk reduction is aimed at preventing new and reducing the existing disaster risk and managing residual risk, all of which contribute to the strengthening resilience and therefore to the achievement of sustainable development. This is the pure definition of disaster risk reduction. And disaster risk management is the application of disaster risk reduction policies and strategies to prevent new disaster risk, reduce existing disaster risk, and manage residual risk, contribute to the strengthening of resilience and reduction of the disaster loss. And coming to the assessment of disaster risk, a quantitative or a qualitative approach to determine the nature and extent of disaster risk by analyzing potential hazards and evaluating existing condition of exposure and vulnerability that together could harm the people, property, service, livelihood, and the environment on which they depend. So this is the definition of the disaster risk reduction, disaster risk management, and disaster risk assessment. So there are so many technical terms like which we have explained already, what the hazard, exposure, vulnerability. So coming to the disaster risk reduction. Development of a local disaster risk reduction strategy is aligned to the national strategies and plan, and also to the global framework, like you may be familiar with Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. And a strategy is an overarching embodiment of expected outcomes, goals to be achieved, and priorities for action. While the action plan is the implementation guide for the strategy that is marked by the strict timeline, budget, and etc. Here on left side of my presentation, 10 elements you have seen. It is quite obvious that many local administration may have their own strategies, and therefore incorporation of following 10 elements ensure that the local strategies are aligned to the requirements of the international global framework like SFDRR, Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. Here, it is coming under 4 main headings. One is monitoring, second one is strategic vision and goal, third is priorities for action, and fourth is guiding principles. So priorities for action, we are going with the 4 priorities. First one is understanding the disaster risk. Second one is strengthening the disaster risk, that governance to manage disaster risk. Third is investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience. So the funding, everything will be coming with the priority 3. And the fourth one is enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and the main terminology is build back better in recovery and rehabilitation and reconstruction stage that I'll be explaining in the coming slides. So instruments for implementation of disaster risk. So what I'm going to present is how we can enforce this techno-legal regime for safer built environment. First is development control regulations and bylaws. So the first and foremost thing is law. This helps to regulate development within the framework of a development plan. The second one is structural design, which the main agenda of the civil engineer. In this, we need to go with the code, adhere to the prescribed design templates, proof checking of the design by the senior structural engineer at the every stage. The next is multi-hazard proofing. Multi-hazard proofing is vulnerability assessment of the existing structure in the hazard-prone area must be conducted by registered structural engineer. Then comes to expansion and maintenance of a building. Then improve public awareness, supervision and quality control, engagement of local stakeholders to participatory process, incentives for safe features and retrofitting, risk-informed planning and budgeting, capacity building for DRR, and ensure safety and functionality of the critical infrastructure and evacuation point. We will be talking about the buildings as well as the critical infrastructure like hospital, everything. So these are the main points which we are supposed to go with this. These are the points which I have shown in as picture. So next is disaster risk management. Till now we have gone with disaster risk reduction, how we can reduce this disaster risk reduction. Next theme is disaster risk management. Now we have understood what disaster risk is, how we can reduce the disaster risk, and let us try to manage it. Manage is something is always easy when it's a down process in it or a process. If it is there, then management of disaster is very much easy. We manage disaster risk on the basis of a cycle, which is commonly known as disaster management cycle, disaster cycle, and we refer as disaster risk management cycle. The cycle is something like this. We can look at it from any point, but for the sake of simplicity, let us start exploring it from the point of prevention. Here in the left side, we have gone with the prevention stage. Measures taken to avoid the occurrence of a disaster. This is the first and foremost thing we need to go with. That is preventing the escalation of a disaster risk into a disaster. Some of very common measures we need to take is proper planning, proper urban planning. We can say it as proper urban planning. River embankment to prevent overflow. Immunization to prevent the spread of disease. Enforcement of code regulation to ensure fire safety of different establishment, or we should go with the enforcement of code at each and every thing, like NBC, National Building Code. For the construction purpose, we should follow the code. And next stage is mitigation. If the prevention stage is over, mitigation. When it is evident that disaster risk can't be prevented, then we move on to the mitigation stage. In mitigation stage, we may take to minimize the impact of the disaster. For example, we can't prevent the earthquake risk, or to be like if an earthquake is to occur, it will occur. There is no way to stop it. But in such cases, what we do is that we construct our houses and building accordingly, so that they do not crumble down. Another very common example is installation of early warning system. Early warning system for impending cyclone or flood, give substantial amount of time to residents to evacuate their homes and find a safe and high ground in such a flood or identify shelter in such a cyclone. So moving ahead, let us now go with preparedness. What preparedness is? Preparedness is the state of readiness which enables stakeholders to mobilize, organize, and provide reliefs to deal with an impending or actual disaster or the effects of a disaster. This is planning how to respond. Examples of preparedness are preparation or updation of disaster management plans, mock exercise for the people over there and the officials over there, establishment of interagency group, security adequate resources, emergency response personnel training, emergency communication systems, and all. So next stage is response stage. Response is the collection of measures taken immediately after an extreme event occurred to alleviate any suffering, pain, injury, or distress or hardship caused. So this is the post-disaster stage response. Response encompass what are the stages of the response stage. First aid, we can provide proper first aid. Search and rescue team, we should deploy search and rescue team. Arrangements for shelter, sanitation, and media management, public warning and evacuation during any disaster like flood, cyclone, or earthquake. And coming to the fourth stage is recovery stage, where all the civil engineer people will have a role on recovery. Recovery encompasses the actions taken by the community or the governance or non-NGOs to build back a community, district, or state after disaster happens. Which means after a disaster, we are preventing and mitigating effects of future hazards. And reconstruction, rehabilitation can be said to be part of entire recovery program. So there are examples are establishment of primary requirement water, food, shelter, proper waste disposal, proper debris clearance, decontamination, damage assessment, relocate community, cultural recovery, provision for the employment, restarting the education, and so on. These are the 4 stages we should think of the disaster risk management. I hope this have been a clear idea of what all goes into the management of disaster risk, right from understanding what disaster risk is, then taking steps to either prevent or mitigate, ensure preparedness, just in case, and then responding to an event, and finally recovering from it. So first point is responsibility of all phases of the management, starting from prevention, mitigation, and finally to recovery, as a collaboration of the whole of the society, all of its institutions, and part of the NGOs, the government and non-governmental organization. So everyone is expected to come together and contribute in all the phases. So pointing out this is the responsibility of all phases of disaster management cycle, starting from prevention, is collectively upon all the society and all its institutions. This is the same thing I have explained in detail. And second one is every action in any of the phase of cycle must be inclusive in nature and done in a sustainable manner. That is, developing strategies or plans for any phase must have involvement in the sections, all sections of the society. We should be inclusive disaster management plan. We should include aged people, differently abled people, different categories of people, and all communities we should consider while planning disaster management. And the concept of build back better, the idea of recovery rests on the concept of building back better. The community of the society post disaster is to build back without vulnerabilities that exist in the first place. So next is disaster risk assessment. What risk assessment is? Risk assessments are produced in order to estimate possible economic, infrastructure, and social impact arising from particular hazard or multi-hazard. So there are 8 stages of disaster risk assessment process. First is identify the asset. Second is determine the critical level of asset. Identify the threats to each critical assets. Identify existing countermeasures, existing security or existing countermeasures. Next is identifying or determining the vulnerability level of each critical asset. Determine the risk level of each critical asset and recommend security upgrades to reduce high level of risk. Perform a cost benefit analysis at the end of the assessment program. A comprehensive risk assessment consists of this following step. First is understanding the current situation, needs and gap to assess what really exists. Avoid duplication of efforts and build on existing information and capacity. Second stage is hazard assessment to identify the nature, location, intensity and likelihood of major hazards prevailing in the community of the society. Third is exposure assessment to identify the population and asset at risk and delineate disaster prone area by using any of the technology. The next stage is vulnerability analysis to determine the capacity of elements at risk. Next is loss impact analysis to identify the potential loss of exposed population, property, services, livelihood and environment. Next is risk profiling and evaluation to identify the cost-effective risk reduction. Next stage is formulation of revision of disaster risk reduction strategies or action plan. So in this there are different stages, contemporary approach to disaster risk assessment. There are different stages. Multi-hazard. The same area may be threatened with different hazards. And multi-sectoral, which include hazards with different type of elements at risk. And multi-level is risk assessment can be carried out different levels like local, district level, regional level, and national level. Multi-stakeholders is risk assessment should involve in relevant stakeholders, which can be individuals, business, organizations, and authorities. Multi-phases, different phase which we have already explained in the disaster management cycle. Risk assessment should consider actions for different stages like prevention stage, mitigation stage, preparedness stage, and recovery and response stage. So in each stage, we should go with the risk assessment, multi-hazard assessment, multi-sectoral assessment, multi-level assessment, multi-stakeholder assessment, and multi-phase assessment. So coming to the qualitative method. So qualitative method describes or characterization of risk in terms of high, moderate, and low. This involves qualitative description or characterization of risk. There we use hazard information does not allow us to express the probability of occurrence, or it is not possible to estimate the magnitude. So what we are doing is we will be making a matrix, risk assessment matrix. In this risk assessment matrix, we'll be go with the assessment. How it is happening is in column A, enter all those hazards from the list which we have prepared in the city. This is a site-specific hazard assessment or risk assessment matrix. And you may need to research these with the local disaster management authority. So in the first column, hazards, you will be adding all the hazards that may occur or that may affect your community. In the second column, column B, hazard livelihood, the likelihood of the occurrence of this event should be mentioned. Like 0 will be low, very low, to the 5 point will be very high. In between 0, you can keep it as very low. sorry, here I have mentioned 1 to 5. It's mistake. Sorry for the mistake. And 1 to 5. 1 is very low, 2 is low, 3 is medium, 4 is high, and 5 is very high. This we can likelihood of the occurrence of the event. And the third column is impact severity. The severity of the impact you expect in your study area, or the severity of the impact to you. Like if a hazard is occurred to your community or your city or your state, how much severe it is. So impact severity in the same scale, 1 to 5 scale: minor, controllable, critical, devastating, and terminal. So in the 5 scale, you can keep it in the column impact severity. And coming to the column D, risk score. This is the multiplication of the hazard and impact severity. You will be getting a score. In the risk score also, we can make it very low, low, medium, high, and very high. In the 5 scale, you can put it over there. And at the end, E, column E, you can convert this risk into a simple priority score. So you can make it as low, medium, and high. Priority, like description, is low, medium, and high. So you will be knowing how to act on the hazard. If a city is prone to flood prone area, you should take assessment, and you should make policies, and you should work on the priority basis. If it is an earthquake prone area, you should go first with the earthquake assessment and then with the flood assessment. In Kerala also, we will be going with the flood more because in the from the 2018 flood, we'll be going more with the flood, and we are not that much hitting with the earthquake. So based on the priority, we will be moving with the planning process and the technical work of the how to reduce this risk. And next method is semi-quantitative method. This technique expresses risk in terms of risk indices like 0 to 1. As in the initial, what all time we will be going with the semi-quantitative method is initial screening process to identify hazards and risk of the city. When the level of the risk does not justify the time and effort, and probability of obtaining numerical data is limited, we will go with a semi-quantitative method. The main difference with qualitative and semi-quantitative approach is the assignments of weight under certain criteria which provide numbers as outcome instead of qualitative clauses. The semi-quantitative estimation for risk assessment is found useful in this following situation. And next is quantitative method. The aim to estimate the spatial and temporal probability of the risk and its magnitude. By using the GIS method, we will be using the spatial and temporal probability of the risk and its magnitude. So this is the quantitative method. So next is vulnerability. What is vulnerability, which we have explained in detail in the previous slides. And here, vulnerability was defined as degree to which a system is exposed and susceptible to the adverse effects of a given hazard. Like what the vulnerability is: exposure to risk and an inability to avoid or absorb potential harm. In formula, we can say it as vulnerability is addition of exposure, resistance, and resilience. Exposure is at-risk property and population. Resistance is measures taken to prevent, and resilience is ability to recover prior state or achieve desired post-disaster state. So there are different types of vulnerability: physical vulnerability, social vulnerability, economic vulnerability, and ecological and environmental vulnerability. Physical vulnerability refers to potential loss to physical infrastructure such as road, bridge, railways, radio and telecommunication, and other features in the built environment. Physical vulnerability also include impact on the human population in terms of injuries and death. Vulnerability is analyzed per group of construction having similar damage performance. It is an intrinsic quality of a structure and it does not depend on the locality or the location. Coming to the social vulnerability, refers to the loss as experienced by people and their social, economic, and political system. In this context, vulnerability refers to extent to which elements of the society such as children, aged population, pregnant ladies, lactating women, single parents, physically and mentally challenged people, poor, social classes, caste, these all being exposed to hazardous condition. Level of the exposure to hazard assess the financial, social and natural institution will be influenced the degree of which individual groups or persons of the system will degrade. And coming to economic vulnerability, this refers to the potential impact of hazards on economic assets and process like loss of productive capacity, business interruptions, secondary effects such as increased poverty and job loss. Economic vulnerability is usually combined with social vulnerability during assessment stage. And ecological and environmental vulnerability refers to the degree of loss that an ecosystem will sustain to its structure, function, and composition as a result of exposure to any hazardous condition. This includes the degradation of biodiversity, loss, and loss of productivity. So these are the types of vulnerability. For the assessment of vulnerability, we'll be going with further how we will be assessing the vulnerability. Variation exists in the method of quantification of vulnerability based on three criteria. Type of vulnerability being measured. That is whether it is a physical vulnerability, social vulnerability, economic vulnerability, and ecological vulnerability. And the scale at which vulnerability is being measured. Whether the vulnerability of an individual we have to measure, or a household, community, or a city, state, and national level vulnerability. And the third is type of hazard. Different hazard type call for different method of quantification, and different vulnerability quantification are used for the different hazard type. So these are the variation exist in the quantification of vulnerability. And what all the data needs for vulnerability assessment? First and foremost thing is historical data. We need to study of the history of the hazard that occurred to the city or the state or the nation, and magnitude of hazard and the level of damage it caused to a specific element such as building built for the concrete or the wood. Socio-economic data such as level of education, how much population is there, sanitation, social network, access to technology. And the emphasis here is that level of access that an individual, household, or community has to various assets. This we may be taking in the socio-economic data, and level of exposure to hazardous condition, and data on policies, institution, and process which influence capacity of individual, households, and community. These are the data need for the vulnerability assessment. So coming to the vulnerability assessment, quantification of degree of loss of susceptibility of an element at risk. So there are different methods, empirical methods and analytical method. There are a wide range of methods for the physical vulnerability. These are the two main methods, empirical method and analytical method. Analytical method rely on the use of geotechnical engineering softwares and are often limited to an individual structure, while the empirical method can be applied to groups of relative structures. In empirical method, there are three: analysis of observed damage, expert opinion, score assessments. Analysis of observed damage is based on the collection and analysis of statistic of damage that occurred in recent and historical events. Experts' opinion is based on asking questions or based on the questionnaire, asking groups of experts on vulnerability to give their opinion. This is limitation because if we are going with the expert opinion, we would be preferring going with the expert of the same area. If I want to know the vulnerability of an district, let it be Ernakulam district, I'll be going with the experts over there in the Ernakulam district who is working in this field. And the third is core assignment method using questionnaire with different parameters to assess the potential damage in relation with the different hazard level. In expert opinion, we'll be asking questions with the expert. Score assessment will be making questionnaires and we'll be taking the data from the history and we'll be measuring with different indices. And coming to the analytical method, there are two different methods, simple analytical method and detailed analytical method. Simple analytical method, studying the behavior of the building and structure based on the engineering criteria, analyzing and to derive the likelihood of failure using computer-based method. This is purely the technical method. And the detailed analytical method using complex method. So this analytical method is purely using the engineering softwares, and the empirical method can be used by the non-technical people. So for methods of measuring socio-economic vulnerability, we were talking about the physical vulnerability, how to measure the vulnerability of a building or a structure. Next comes the socio-economic vulnerability. Socioeconomic vulnerability is an indicator based and can be assessed by analyzing the level of exposure and coping mechanism of individual, household, and community. This flowchart will explain in detail how to go with socioeconomic vulnerability. First and foremost thing is identify the elements for vulnerability assessment. And analyzing the exposure and coping is done taking into consideration the policies and process and adaptation strategies of affected individual and households of the community. Here it is explained in this flowchart. First, to identify the elements. Second is exposure. In exposure state, rank the identified individual, household or community based on their level of exposure. Then comes to the set of socio-economic indicators, then coping capacity of that. After that, we will be categorizing in three categories: low vulnerability, moderate vulnerability, and high vulnerability. This, after finding out the how much vulnerable it is, we will be work on based on vulnerability exposure, like how much vulnerable it is. Low exposure. In the low vulnerable category, they may be low exposure and high coping capacity. Moderate vulnerable is the moderate exposure and moderate coping capacity. And for the high vulnerable community, they will be highly exposed and they will be low coping capacity. Methods for representing vulnerability. So, for finding out representing vulnerability, we'll be going with the vulnerability indices, vulnerability tables, and vulnerability curves. Based on the indicators of vulnerability, mostly no direct relation with the different hazard intensities, mostly used for expressing social, economic, and environmental vulnerability. We'll be taking indices, sub-indices, and parameters for vulnerability indices method. And vulnerability table, the relation between hazard intensity and degree of damage can also be given in a table. And if you are coming with the vulnerability curves, relative curves are there, absolute curves are there, and fragile curves are there. There are so many examples available in the internet for the vulnerability curve. If you want, I can give you the references for the vulnerability representation. I have only given the names for the vulnerability representation. And how we can reduce the vulnerability. Since we cannot reduce the occurrence and severity of the natural hazard, reducing vulnerability is one of the main opportunity for reducing the disaster risk. So there are different approaches. Vulnerability changing over time becomes many of the processes that influence vulnerability are dynamic and include rapid urbanization, environmental degradation, market condition, and demographic change. And approaches to vulnerability reduction include implementation of building codes, ensure and social protection, emphasis economic diversity and resilient livelihoods, knowledge and awareness raising, and preparedness measures. And coming to hazard risk vulnerability analysis, this is to mitigate disaster related risk. It is essential to understand the relation between hazard and vulnerabilities in any given area. So advantages of carrying out this hazard risk vulnerability assessment, HRVA, this community can develop effective warning and evacuation system. That early warning system they can develop. Community planning initiative can factor in potential risk to housing stocks and economic activities. Equipped with an understanding of community's vulnerability to particular hazard, mitigation projects can reduce the risk of a disaster and its consequences. Well-informed communities are well-prepared communities and can collectively work together, preventing potential disaster-induced losses. This is why we are supposed to go with hazard risk vulnerability analysis of any city, any panchayat or municipality, in the city level, district level, state level, and the national level. For conducting HRVA of a city, there are different stages. First is preparation of hazard and exposure database, which we have already explained. This is purely repetition, I know, but the thing is, for each and everything, we need to go with the same steps. First thing is preparation of hazard and exposure database. For this, we need to study the historic hazards that have happened on the city and mapping vulnerable population. That is, do the spatial mapping of the vulnerable population. And third is understanding building vulnerability. That is, assess the infrastructure, assets, and identify the weak building. For this, one method is familiar, rapid visual screening. That is how we can assess the building whether it is highly vulnerable or not. And next is exposure database, risk assessment, and risk reduction measures. Ascertain the probability of intensity and frequency of disaster hazard, and priority. Next is prioritizing the risk reduction measures based on the understanding of the risk, which we have already explained: high risk, moderate risk, and low risk. So what are data required for conducting hazard risk vulnerability assessment at city level? First thing is, need a base map with different thematic layers like geology, topology, land use, land cover, lithology, natural drainage, transportation network, emergency lifeline system, piped conduit building based service, telecommunication system. So after getting a base map, we'll be categorizing data into three categories: hazard data set, vulnerability data set, and capacity data set. So after getting this, we'll be go with the hazard risk vulnerability assessment of the city level. So coming to, after doing all these things, coming to city disaster management plan. This is the ultimate thing for every city, and we should carry out different stages. There are different steps for preparation of city development plan. This first stage is carried out the detailed research. Review of the city planning framework, analyze the past hazard, determine the resource base, and note the key characteristics of the city that can guide the emergency operation. So next is conduct the hazard risk vulnerability analysis. Next is determine the resource base, that is map and list of existing capacity, identify the gaps and take suitable initiative. Next is geographic, topography and demographic characteristics of the study area. A detailed analysis of geography, topography and demographic characteristics are must for mitigation and disaster response and recovery stages. Develop a disaster management plan, validation of the plan, review of the plan, test the plan, regular updation of the plan, remedial action process and plan distribution and approval. So developing a disaster management plan, a detailed plan that documents the key roles and responsibilities of all stakeholders, risk analysis, vulnerability, emergency support to serve as a ready recurrent for the department to take appropriate action during any disaster. So next is disaster risk sensitive planning. Risk sensitive planning involves mainstreaming the disaster risk management within the governance and operations of public and private institutions, particularly in spatial and physical development programs. These are the 10 risk sensitive planning. So, which we have already explained is comprehensive assessment of hazard, risk, vulnerability and capacity, application of planning laws, development of base map, participatory discussion to analyze local context, revision of existing development plan, public awareness program for increased knowledge base, capacity building for planning as well as implementation, focus on children, women, elderly and different abled persons need, addressing budget requirement for risk sensitive planning. These are the basic steps for risk sensitive planning. This risk sensitive planning is in method for disaster risk reduction. For risk sensitive planning, first and foremost thing is environmental planning. This environmental planning is identify the natural features such as drainage channel and water body that need to be protected. Identify the high risk zones for population, high population and investment concentration. Use suitable analysis to match best land parcels for specific use. Identify the carrying capacity of natural and built system. Use participatory assessment and planning for multi-layered GIS analysis. This is the environmental planning stage. Second stage is designing safer and greener building. Safety and sustainability need to be ensured in building made by various material, catering to different income groups and functions. Create a building inventory of the city. Keep it updated in real time. Publicize in simple terms and key aspect of safe construction. Strengthen training, certification, monitoring of architect, engineers, construction, contractors, and masons. Identify low-income areas with non-engineering building and apply mandatory rules of thumb. Encourage green building with water harvesting, solar passive design, solar photovoltaic energy, and waste management and landscaping. And third is improving the preparedness of cities to respond for shocks and stress. Shocks are rapid onset disaster with low probability but very high impact, like earthquake. Stresses are slow onset disasters with high probability yet low impact. That is water stress or waterlogging leads to diseases. And the last stage is designing safer infrastructure. Infrastructure is one of the key elements for the smooth operation and survival of a city. Infrastructure itself needs to be safe for citizens, must be resilient and disaster. There are three infrastructure: physical infrastructure, social infrastructure, economic and institutional infrastructure. Physical infrastructure is the physical thing like design of houses, roads, electricity network, sewerage, water supply, public utilities that are assessed for their exposure to disaster risk due to their location, quality of construction and maintenance. Follow up with risk reduction measures through planning and retrofitting for the buildings, existing building. Social infrastructure is ensure that the school, health facilities, community spaces are assessed for their risk exposure and appropriate mitigation and preparedness plans are put in place. Economic and institutional are bank, financial institution, administrative establishment, and their safety ensured through planning and retrofitting interventions. So after going with, this is the main agenda of risk, disaster risk assessment and management, what vulnerability is, what vulnerable assessment is, and how we can go with the disaster management plan and risk sensitive planning to reduce the disaster risk. So we can go just a case study of 2018 flood. I'm not going in detail with the case study of 2018 flood, but how impacted on the housing sectors. We can just go through this. During the 2018 flood and landscape, total number of fully damaged houses are 16,380. Total number of partially damaged houses are 3.27 lakhs. And total effects like damage plus loss, 6,410 crores. These are the photographs from the 2018 Kerala floods and landscape. So we'll be seeing all the Kerala floods and impact. Why this impact? This is the main causes: lack of adequate disaster resistant features as recommended in the NBC, the lack of horizontal bands to hold the wall together, inadequate depth of random rubble, and low plinth height resulting in inundation for days. The inundation of the building for several days causing differential settlement of the foundation, high current of flood water and flash floods. And it was noted that many buildings that adhered to the NBC, National Building Code, did not collapse or sustain structural damage even though they were inundated up to lintel or roof level for several days and only has to undergo minor repairs. So there comes the importance of hazard resilient construction. What is hazard resilient construction? This is purely a vast topic. This is I'm not able to include all the hazard resilient construction in this session, but I just want to keep a light on the hazard resilient construction because we civil engineers are the role, have to take this role during the post and pre-disaster phase. What is hazard resilient building? Damages of building due to any type of disaster is minor, can easily be repaired, usable immediately after disaster with least cost of time. So key factors to be considered while building a safe and sustainable habitat is first is consideration for appropriate siting of structure, and second is model designs and application of hazard resistance in construction. This is consideration for appropriate siting is safe site, which is away from landslide prone area, steep slope, falling rocks, loose soil, polluted water, well-drained area, flood-prone area, on landfills. These should be keep in mind for the safe site selection. And the second one is model design and application of hazard resistance in construction, where comes the role of architects and civil engineers. For earthquake resistant building, frame or band at different places, shear wall should be placed, cross bracings, base isolation, brick joinery. For flood resistant building, raised plinth, building on tilt, strong plinth, waterproofing of houses. For cyclone, suitable location to minimize wind force, roof tied to wall, firm fixing of building components together, improved aerodynamics of the structure, long root bearing plant trees as windbreakers, landslide, proper site selection, designing of retaining wall. So these points we should consider while construction of buildings or residence as a civil engineer or an architect to reduce the disaster risk or impact of the disaster. So For concluding this, disaster risk reduction cannot prevent hazards from taking place, but can definitely reduce the impact of disasters. By concluding this, I would like to tell you. First thing is, I was lit a bit fast, and I thought this will be getting a glance of idea about what disaster risk, vulnerability, and how to reduce this disaster risk. So, any questions on discussion? I'm happy to be a part of the discussions rather than the questions.
Thank you, ma'am. Dear participants, if you have any queries, you can just unmute your mic and discuss with Reshma madam, or you can put it in the chat box. Dear participants, if you have any queries, you can just unmute your mic and ask your doubts.
And if you want to clear my thinking, or you want to correct things, so that is also fine.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yeah, sure.
Ma'am, how do you carry out that rapid visual screening test to understand the building vulnerability?
Yeah. Uh, can you unmute mute, because it's echo is coming. This rapid visual screening, actually, I'm so happy that rapid visual screening is now familiar with everyone. There are some questionnaires and some score chart for the rapid visual screening. So what we are doing is, the experts who are civil engineers or architects or diploma holders, they will be going and checking different sectors of a building. That name itself, rapid visual screening, we won't be getting detail of the structure as such, but we will be checking whether it is having the fire safety equipments, whether the building is retrofitted properly, whether the opening is there, whether they are having the staircase properly, escape routes are there. So there are some questions, and we'll be putting scores to the questions and indices, and altogether we will be finalizing the score of the building. On that basis, we will be identifying whether the building is highly vulnerable to the disaster, or highly whether the building is strong, or we need to go with the retrofitting. So this is a vast area, retrofitting. You can have a session on the building resilience in the further future time, because nowadays retrofitting and rapid visual screening is done for the most of the buildings in Kerala, but proper management is not there. But some NGOs are there to do the retrofitting and rapid visual screening. And when I worked in urban disaster, Kerala State Disaster Management Authority as urban planner, we had a collaboration project with UNDP, and we did nearly 1,000 buildings from Ernakulam district, and we did rapid visual screening of nearly 200 buildings, and we have finalized the building whether it is highly vulnerable, and least vulnerable, and moderate vulnerable. These three categories we have found. And for this, rapid visual screening is mainly done for the vulnerability assessment of the building in any area. This is a bit technical thing. I can share the how we can go with the rapid visual screening materials, and if you want, you can contact me through my mail. I can share the references.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Any other dear participants? Any other doubts? Dear participants, any other doubts? Please feel free to ask, or otherwise put it into the chat box. think
I hope
no.
this is maybe that's too clear to the participants over
Yes.
there, or the thing is, it's purely technical. They don't have any question to ask, and I hope everyone got a clear idea of what I expected. And if you have any doubt, or if you want to know more about this, any of the session related to the disaster management, feel free to contact me through mail and the phone number which I have displayed over there, and I can share the number through your coordinators. And I'm so happy to be a part of this faculty development program, and I will be happy to be more contact with the participants over there, and I can share my experience with you people, and you can share your experience with me also at any time and at any point of time. So I hope this is a bit clear. I hope for the positive side, I hope everyone is clear with what I expected to make it
Sure,
clear.
ma'am. Sure.
And
I
all the best.
appreciate your assistance, ma'am. Thank you. We'll have a feedback session.
Sure.
Okay. I would like to call upon Ms. Sumaya PB, Lecturer in Civil, GPTC Adur, to share her experience regarding the session. Ma'am?
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, ma'am. Myself is Sumaya. I'm lecturer from Government Polytechnic College, Adur. First of all, thank you, dear Reshma madam, for your amazing lecture. It was really informative, and you explained about the disaster risk, their fundamentals, then different approaches, then how to quantify the vulnerability, then the data needed, then different methods, I think, for representing, how to represent vulnerability, how to reduce it, etc. Also, you were telling clearly about how to conduct a hazard risk vulnerability and analysis, different stages of it. Then how to develop a city disaster management plan and risk sensitive planning, etc. Also, you gave us an idea about the hazard resilient construction also. Altogether, we got an overview of disaster risk assessment, management and assessment. And you explained everything in detail and made it easier for us to understand actually. And I appreciate your time and appreciate you sharing your valuable understanding also. Thank you, madam. Also, I thank Government Polytechnic College, Kottayam, and each and every members associated with this faculty development program. Thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sumaya madam. Okay, Reshma madam, once again, thank you in the name of GPTC Kottayam for sharing your valuable time and insight with us.
Okay, thank you very much for involving me to this faculty development program and got a chance to discuss with you people. And I hope everyone is clear with my vision and presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, madam. Ma'am, you can leave.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, participants, feedback come. Attendance link is shared in the chat box. All of you submit the form and ensure your attendance. With this, we will wind up our fifth session. Participants, please join at sharp 2 p.m. for the next session, our final session. And don't forget to fill the attendance form, as you all know. Thank you all. Thank you so much.